Is it alcohol? Is it marijuana? Is it cocaine? Is it pills for some of them? The answer, it was said, was all of the above at different times in different hotel rooms, on different nights. Drugs do not negotiate. They do not care about beauty, talent, or history. They strip away youth, hollow out bodies, and leave what look like walking shadows where Hollywood once saw goddesses. Souls that seemed untouchable on the red carpet end up drowning quietly in liquor and powder. Among those stories there were 17 black actresses who, according to reports, went from being celebrated on billboards and premiere carpets to falling one after another in scenes that people close to them still hesitate to describe. The hand of addiction did not simply nudge them off course. It dragged them from the highest balcony of fame down into the lowest, filthiest depths, back alleys, anonymous apartments, hospital corridors with no cameras. In this investigation, we walk through those descents one by one, not to sensationalize their suffering, but to expose how far and how fast addiction pushed these black screen icons. The question is not just how they fell, but how terrifyingly deep they were allowed to sink before anyone truly tried to pull them back. 1. Tamara Dobson, the Cleopatra goddess, turned into a living mummy on stage. In 1973, when Cleopatra Jones hit theaters, Tamara Dobson didn't just appear on screen, she detonated onto it. Standing 6'2" with a stare that could quiet an entire room and a walk that felt more like a royal procession, she became, for many, the first true black female action hero in mainstream cinema. America watched stunned as a black woman in towering heels and trench coats commanded every frame. But like a firework, that brilliance was brief. It burned bright, then vanished into the dark. When Hollywood turned its back on the blaxploitation era and declared the genre over, it was as if someone flipped a switch. Studios pulled the plug. Budgets dried up. The phone that once never stopped ringing went silent. According to people who knew her, Tamara's name seemed to disappear from contract lists almost overnight, as though she had been deleted from the system. That was when the nightmare reportedly began. By the late 1970s, her small Los Angeles apartment had, as friends later described it, the feel of a tomb that still contained a living person. No ringing phone, no new roles, no stylists knocking on the door. Just the clink of bottles hitting the trash and the soft scatter of pills across the floorboards. Whiskey, painkillers, anything that could mute the sound of a career cut short became part of her daily routine. On the morning of July 12, 1979, it was said that her closest friend unlocked the door and froze. Tamara lay motionless on the sofa, heavy with the smell of alcohol, the floor around her littered with shattered capsules and tablet dust. She was still alive, but barely. No major paper ran that story. No urgent headlines. Hollywood simply looked away. The woman once framed as a real life, Cleopatra had become, in the industry's eyes, disposable. Over the years that followed, alcohol and pills reportedly carved away at her body. The legendary dark hair, once her crown, thinned and fell in clumps on her pillow. The powerful frame that had once filled the screen shrank until, as witnesses later recalled, she looked like a fragile figure draped in an old silk dress, rather than the towering icon people remembered. Every step in heels that had once symbolized power started to feel to those who watched her like a cruel test she could barely pass. The humiliation reached its breaking point in 1987 at a fashion show in Baltimore. The audience, according to press at the time, buzzed with expectation. They whispered about a comeback, hoping to see the triumphant return of Cleopatra Jones herself. But when the velvet curtain finally lifted, the room went silent. In front of them stood a trembling silhouette, eyes sunken, body shockingly thin, posture unsteady under the lights. Cameras captured what one brutal headline later summarized in a single sentence: "Cleopatra is now nothing more than a living mummy." The words were merciless. They followed her like a curse. After that, Tamara disappeared from the public eye. To pay for medicine and mounting debts, she was reportedly forced to sell the very costumes that had once made her a legend the iconic outfits from Cleopatra Jones that fans still remembered. Friends say she confessed bitterly that she had gone from gliding down red carpets in expensive silk to begging her doctor to let her owe money for basic medication. Each visit felt like another small cut to whatever pride she had left. In her final years, Tamara lived quietly in a nursing facility in Baltimore. A cold white room, the smell of disinfectant, machines tracking what remained of her strength. Multiple sclerosis left her paralyzed lungs so weakened that every breath became deliberate and painful work. On the afternoon of October 2, 2006, she took her last breath in near total solitude. 2. Tamara Dobson, once hailed as America's Cleopatra, died like a ghost, far away from movie sets, forgotten by the industry she had helped reshape. The system that had once needed her image did not show up at the end. And that is the first cruel pattern in this story, an industry that turns black women into icons when it suits the moment, then lets them fade into silence, once their bodies break under the weight of pressure and addiction. Pam Grier, the sex symbol and the infertility sentence hidden in white powder. Pam Grier was not just famous. For a time she was the image that defined an entire era. When Coffee premiered in the summer of 1973, audiences saw something they had never really seen before on a mainstream screen, a black woman storming through the frame with a gun in her hand and fire in her eyes, confronting men who had always held the power. A year later, Foxy Brown turned that impact into legend. Critics crowned her a sex symbol, a queen of American cinema. Posters of her covered bedroom walls and theater lobbies. Her body, her attitude, her face all became marketable symbols of liberation and danger wrapped together. But as insiders later recalled, while the public watched Pam Grier blaze across screens, another quieter story had already begun. The same Hollywood that cheered her strength was soaked in a different kind of addiction, lines of cocaine, passed around like party favors, offered in studios, backstage rooms, and private houses in the hills. One night, in September 1975, according to accounts that followed, Pam bent over a polished mirror on Sunset Strip and inhaled cocaine for the first time. The effect was instant. The rush, the false confidence, the feeling that she could outpace exhaustion and stay ahead of the industry's shifting tastes. It sold itself as a solution. In reality, she had just stepped across the threshold of a new kind of trap. Over the years that followed, cocaine reportedly became a constant presence, a shadow attached to her schedule. Long days on set blurred into long nights at parties. By the early 1980s, the damage was no longer hidden. In a quiet examination room in Los Angeles, her personal doctor, she later said, spoke with brutal clarity. If she did not stop, she might not survive much longer. The warning felt like ice in the bloodstream, but a lecture could not reverse what had already happened inside her body. Over time, her cycles became irregular pain, sharpened, and tests delivered a devastating conclusion. Her reproductive system had been seriously harmed, a consequence doctors believed of years of stress, lifestyle, and drug use. When the doctor finally told her she would likely never conceive, she reportedly broke down, burying her face in her hands and whispering words she would later repeat in interviews that cocaine had stolen her chance to become a mother. She would go on to describe that wound as the one injury success could never fix. A career could be rebuilt. Roles could return. Awards and attention could come back around with enough patience and luck. But the sound she had once imagined, her own baby crying in her arms, would remain a silence she could never fill. In later reflections, Pam Grier admitted that every time she saw another woman holding a child, something in her recoiled and ached. Drugs had not just taken away health and years. They had taken away, in her words, the most sacred dream she carried for herself. 3. Dorothy Dandridge, the Oscar star who reached for help in the dark. Everyone in old Hollywood knew Dorothy Dandridge's name. In 1954, when she walked the red carpet for Carmen Jones wearing a red dress that seemed to set the night on fire, she broke through a wall no one else had pierced. She became the first black woman ever nominated for an Academy Award for Best Actress. They called her The Black Rose. But the nomination, which should have been a beginning, turned out to be a cruel mirage. Once the Oscar season ended and the cameras turned away, Hollywood did not open its doors wider for her. It narrowed them. Leading roles for a black woman were still scarce, tightly controlled, often token. The industry that had celebrated her as an exception had no long-term plan for her. Then the personal blows began to stack. Her first marriage to Harold Nicholas collapsed in infidelity and distance, leaving her to shoulder the weight of motherhood on her own. Her second marriage to Jack Dennison initially looked like a refugee, but according to accounts from the time, it devolved into financial exploitation and emotional cruelty. When that marriage ended, Dorothy was not only alone, she was nearly broke, humiliated, and tired. Worse still was the heartbreak that never left her, her daughter Heroine born with severe brain damage and unable to live independently. Dorothy adored her, visited her, and fought for her care. But eventually, with her resources drained and work disappearing, she was forced to place her child in a specialized facility. To those close to her, she reportedly confessed in anguish that she felt like a failed mother. That guilt became another weight she carried into every room. Drained by betrayal, financial ruin, and a brutal sense of parental failure, Dorothy began to look for escape wherever she could find it. Alcohol, sleeping pills. Nights faded into each other as she tried to buy a few hours of numbness. The beautiful face the world had once praised grew puffy. Her eyes lost their spark. People who saw her at parties whispered that the Oscar nominee had become a cautionary tale. At one Beverly Hills gathering, she reportedly collapsed with a glass in her hand. The room reacted with gossip instead of concern. The same town that once lined up to see her on screen now watched from a distance as she unraveled. On the night of September 7, 1965, in her modest West Hollywood apartment, Dorothy picked up the phone. According to one account, her voice shook as she told a friend she could not go on like this. It was a plea, another attempt to be heard above the noise of her own collapse. By morning it was too late. Dorothy Dandridge was found lifeless on the floor. An empty bottle. Scattered pills. The official reports could not quite agree: overdose, embolism, some fatal convergence of exhausted body and chemical escape. In the end, the category no longer mattered. What mattered was the image burned into history, the first black woman ever nominated for Best Actress gone alone, and nearly penniless, in a town that had once dressed her up as its symbol of progress. There was no grand farewell, no studio-organized tribute while she was still alive to hear it. Her death left behind an uncomfortable question: how does an industry celebrate a barrier-breaking black woman on Sunday night, and then let her face her worst battles in almost total isolation? Dorothy's story is not just about addiction. It is about an entire system that opened one door for her and then locked the rest, leaving her to fight her way through darkness with no real backup until she simply could not anymore. Tina Turner, the queen of rock and roll, trapped in the dark. 4. Tina Turner was born in 1939 in Nutbush, Tennessee, a small place that seemed too narrow for the force she would become. As a teenager, she chased stages and microphones with a raw hunger. By the 1970s, that hunger had turned into domination. She stood at the summit of rock and roll, a voice like thunder, legs like steel hair flying as arenas roared back at her. But behind the explosive performances, her life was tightening into a nightmare. Her husband and musical partner, Ike Turner, was the same person who had lifted her onto the world's biggest stages, and it was said chained her there in terror. He controlled the money, the bookings, the band, and her movements. What looked like a partnership from the outside often felt, according to her later accounts, more like captivity. He didn't just shout. He hit. He belittled. And he reportedly pushed drugs into the spaces where her fear lived. Cocaine entered her life, not as a party trick, but as a survival tool. It was presented as a way to stay awake on endless tours, to perform through bruises, to keep going when her body and mind were screaming to stop. One July night in 1976, in Dallas, the story goes, that Ike punched Tina in the face just minutes before they were supposed to walk on stage. Blood on her collar, pain buzzing in her skull, the clock ticking down. There was no time for recovery, only ritual. She was pressured to snort cocaine in the dressing room, wipe away what she could, straighten her wig, and step out into the glare. The lights were blinding. The applause shook the venue. To the crowd, she was a storm untouchable. Inside, she was enduring what she would later describe as almost unbearable pain, physical and emotional, layered on top of years of humiliation. In her memoir, Tina would eventually reveal that at one point, consumed by despair, she took an overdose of sleeping pills. It was not a cry for attention. It was in her own telling, an attempt to escape everything at once. A friend found her in time. Doctors intervened. The world kept its queen of rock and roll, but barely. In 1978, after more than a decade of violence and control, she filed for divorce and walked away. She did not leave with mansions or a vast fortune. She walked out with little more than her stage name, Tina Turner, and a determination to rebuild from zero. The years that followed would see her rise again, higher than before, in a legendary second act. But no matter how many sold-out shows or awards followed, she would later admit that a whole piece of her life, her youth, had been handed over to darkness, violence, fear, and drugs she never truly chose for herself. Her comeback was real. So were the years the world cannot give back to her. 5. Natalie Cole almost dying in an apartment no one was supposed to see. Natalie Cole arrived in the 1970s and 1980s as a bright, undeniable star, her voice carrying both warmth and precision, her presence strong enough to cross from music into television and film. Roles like Lily in Lily and Winter reminded audiences that she was not just Nat King Cole's daughter. She was powerful in her own right. But that legacy was a double-edged blade. As a student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Natalie reportedly slipped into heroin and cocaine use. What some friends thought was simple exhaustion, her collapsing in a dorm room in December 1973, lips discolored, heartbeat racing, was, according to later accounts, one of the first visible cracks in a decade-long descent. Her father's shadow followed her everywhere. Nat King Cole was not just a legend, he was a standard she felt expected to match or surpass. Every time she stepped on stage, she carried the fear that she wasn't enough, that she was only Nat's daughter, and not truly herself. In that pressure, drugs became a false ally, a fast escape from doubt and expectation. Years of use battered her body. By May 1983, the cost almost came due in full. In a Los Angeles apartment, friends found her on the edge of death after an overdose. An ambulance was called. In the hospital, doctors reportedly had to shock her heart back into rhythm, pulling her away from a line most people never return from. Shortly after, Natalie entered rehab. There she faced long nights of withdrawal, shaking, sweating, staring at the ceiling, fighting a battle no one could fight in her place. Newspapers mentioned the headlines. Few understood that each quiet morning she woke up was another decision not to go backward. By the 1990s, she re-emerged in triumph with Unforgettable with Love, a project that used new technology to let her sing alongside her late father's voice. The world treated it as proof that she had conquered her demons. A full circle, a victory lap. But according to those close to her, the scars were not just emotional. They were physical. Needle marks hidden beneath long sleeves and glamorous gowns. Health issues that would never fully relent. Even as she held a Grammy in 1992, some people said the old shadows were still visible in her eyes, reminders of nights when everything could have ended in silence. On December 31, 2015, Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles announced that Natalie Cole had died from heart failure and pneumonia. The medical verdict pointed back toward the long-term damage left by heroin and cocaine. Death arrived on New Year's Eve, a date usually associated with countdown, celebration, and hope. For her, it became a final, bitter closing of the curtain. Her legacy is enormous. Her voice, her records, her performances will outlive the headlines. But the story cannot be told honestly without acknowledging the years addiction stole, years that could have been lived in full instead of fought in fragments. From hotel rooms and dormitories to hospital beds and quiet apartments, Natalie Cole's journey is another reminder that talent, lineage, and fame are no match for an addiction left to grow in the dark. Whoopi Goldberg, the Broadway clown performing high on cocaine. In the early 1980s, Whoopi Goldberg was that strange new presence everyone in New York theater seemed to be whispering about. Sharp, fearless, able to make an audience howl with laughter and then fall silent on a single line. By 1985, The Color Purple would catapult her into the Hollywood stratosphere. But while the world saw a rising star, another story was playing out behind the curtains. According to her own later admissions, Whoopi's life at that time was tangled up with cocaine. The reasons weren't just the usual career pressure line. Her first marriage had collapsed. Brief, unsatisfying relationships came and went. The loneliness between shows, between cities, between people who only knew the stage version of her, it all built a kind of emptiness she didn't know how to face sober. Cocaine stepped in as the false solution. In 1984, whispers swept through the theater world. Whoopi had performed an entire Broadway show while high. In the audience, no one saw it. They rose to their feet at the end, giving her a standing ovation. She hit every beat, every joke, every pause with perfect timing. To them, it was a flawless night. Backstage, the picture was different. Colleagues later described her coming off stage drenched in sweat, hands, trembling eyes, red and unfocused. The transformation was jarring, the confident performer in the spotlight, and the shaken woman behind it. Cocaine allowed her to power through exhaustion and pain, but it also split her life in two. Publicly, she was the bold comic and serious actress on the rise. Privately, she was fighting a chemical grip she hadn't fully acknowledged yet. It took years for Whoopi to pull free and rebuild her balance. By the time she did, the damage to her youth was already stamped into memory. Nights she could not get back, moments of success forever fused to the presence of a drug that tried to claim her. Her latest stability and longevity in the industry stand in stark contrast to those early years, when the laughter she delivered on stage hit a quieter, more dangerous battle no one could see from their seats. 7. Oprah Winfrey, the media queen, and the lover who led her to the edge. Long before she became the most powerful woman in American television, Oprah Winfrey was a young reporter and host carrying a lifetime of pain in her 20s. Born into poverty, scarred by abuse, she stepped into local TV work in Baltimore, weighted down with experiences most people never speak about. Then she fell in love with the wrong man. The relationship was, by later accounts, a mix of emotional abuse and dependency. The man she was attached to was also consumed by drugs. In that tangle of need and harm, Oprah was pulled into the same world. Lonely nights, turning into nights fogged with cocaine and crack smoke. What started as an escape from hurt quickly became a new source of danger. One night, in September 1983, just weeks before she would be offered the job on AM Chicago that would change everything, the story goes that she hit bottom. In a cramped apartment, overwhelmed by the breakup with her addicted partner and the chaos of her life, she spiraled into a dangerous binge. By the time a close friend arrived, the scene was reportedly bleak, cut straws residue on the table, Oprah herself in tears, saying she just wanted to forget everything. If that night had become public, it might have destroyed her career before it truly began. But hospital files were sealed, and those who knew stayed silent. The moment passed without headlines. The opportunity from AM Chicago arrived like a door swinging open at the last possible second. Oprah, understanding just how close she had come to losing everything, cut herself off from drugs with brutal urgency. She redirected the same intensity that could have swallowed her into a drive that eventually built a media empire. From the outside, her story looks like a straightforward rise from local host to national phenomenon to global figure. But hidden inside that arc is a single fragile truth. One more reckless night in 1983, one more step deeper into crack, and the woman who would become the queen of daytime television might have vanished before anyone outside of Baltimore knew her name. 8. Whitney Houston, the incident that foretold the end. Whitney Houston's voice did not just reach notes. It seemed to erase the space between her and the listener. In the 1980s, she soared to the top of global music with a sound that felt effortless, pure, invincible. Then came The Bodyguard in 1992, and I Will Always Love You, the kind of cultural moment that freezes a person in legend. But the brighter the spotlight burned, the deeper the shadows stretched behind it. Inside that darkness were arguments and jealousy with Bobby Brown, the suffocating pressure of being billed as the flawless global star, and the terror of having to outdo herself night after night in front of millions. From that cauldron, cocaine, and later crack, slipped into her life, sold as a way to calm nerves and cope with an expectation no human could really sustain. The deeper she went, the less control she had. During her 1999 European tour, an incident reportedly unfolded in a German hotel that would be whispered about for years. When her team could not reach her for hours, panic spread through the hallway. Locked door. No response. When it was finally opened, according to backstage accounts, she was found collapsed in the bathroom, breathing heavy white traces on the tile. The show that night was suddenly canceled due to illness. Officially, it was fatigue. Unofficially, everyone around her understood something far more serious had happened. After that, people who heard her live said something in her voice had changed. Those impossible top notes, once effortless, sounded strained. Breath control slipped. On stage, her eyes sometimes carried a tiredness that even the brightest lighting could not fully hide. She pushed through, tried comebacks, gave the world more music. But the cracks in the foundation were visible, at least to those who knew what to look for. Then came February 11, 2012, at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles. News broke that Whitney Houston had been found dead in a hotel bathroom on the eve of the Grammy Awards. The coroner's report listed drowning with cocaine and other substances in her system. The world reacted with shock, grief, and a sense of inevitability that felt cruel in its honesty. The woman whose voice had once seemed untouchable had been worn down by the same substances that had swallowed so many of her peers. Whitney's story is not just the story of addiction. It is the story of genius placed under impossible demands of a black woman, turned into an untouchable icon, and then criticized relentlessly for the very cracks that relentless pressure produced. Her final chapter sealed a tragedy that had been building in plain sight, a reminder that behind the glory of global success, there had long been a private battle she was losing piece by piece. 9. Chaka Khan. White traces swept off the floor. Chaka Khan was crowned the queen of funk and R&B long before most people understood how rare her presence truly was. In the 1970s and 1980s, her voice didn't just hit notes, it shook rooms. Her appearance in the Blues Brothers and her string of hits made her a fixture in pop culture. When she stepped on stage, it felt like the lights were answering to her, not the other way around. But the same life that built her legend also pressed her toward the edge. Endless touring, back-to-back studio sessions, and the pressure to stay at the top created a brutal rhythm. Late nights blurred into early mornings. At first, according to those around her, substances entered the picture as tools, ways to stay awake, to keep the show moving. Then it escalated. Heroin, cocaine, alcohol. What started as a way to manage the grind slowly became the grind. The price surfaced in September 1984 in Los Angeles. After a run of exhausting recording nights, Chaka was reportedly found unconscious in a hotel room. The air was cold. A towel hung half off a chair. A glass rested on the table, tilted, its contents partially spilled. The official line to the public was simple exhaustion. Behind-the-scenes whispers told a different story. People spoke quietly of white traces hurried off the floor before anyone outside the inner circle could see. of a near disaster framed as nothing more than overwork. Only a year later, in July 1985 in Chicago, a major partnership deal was set to solidify her next chapter. At the last moment it fell apart. Chaka vanished from contact for days with rumors that she had suffered another collapse. Management, according to those familiar with the period, scrambled to contain the fallout, cutting off calls, redirecting questions, and doing everything possible to keep her star image from shattering in real time. When she re-emerged, something had shifted. The opportunities that once came easily were fewer. Her health was chiseled down. Big projects slipped quietly out of reach. Later, Chaka would speak openly about entering rehab and doing the work to rebuild. She confronted what had taken a decade from her. Even as she returned to the stage stronger, she admitted that the 10 peak years, the years when her voice and presence could have dominated on an even larger scale, had been swallowed whole by addiction. Instead of a full-color reel of triumphs, that period became, in her own reflection, more like a flickering black-and-white film of what might have been doors closing that would never open again. 10. Vanity, the siren at war with her own body. Denise Matthews, known to the world as Vanity, was one of the most striking faces of the 1980s. She moved alongside Prince Sean in The Last Dragon and became a symbol of dangerous allure and electric charm. On stage and on screen, she looked untouchable, slick leather smoky eyes, a presence that seemed made for the era's fantasies. But offstage Vanity was fighting a war against something far more relentless than gossip or critics. Crack cocaine entered her life as a supposed escape. It did not just derail her career. It slowly turned her own body into a battlefield. Years later, in 2015, doctors delivered a diagnosis that sounded like something from a medical horror file, encapsulating peritoneal sclerosis, a rare condition where the membrane lining the abdomen hardens and tightens around the intestine. For a woman once celebrated for her figure and physical power, it was a devastating reversal. Her strength faded. Her abdomen swelled. Pain wrapped around her like a vise, making simple movement a test of endurance. Fans still pictured her as the fiery, magnetic figure in music videos and movie scenes. In reality, she was spending long stretches in a hospital, relying on daily peritoneal dialysis just to stay alive. The financial fall was as stark as the physical one. From million-dollar paychecks and luxury to asking the public for help to cover soaring medical bills, the contrast stunned even those familiar with Hollywood's cruelty. The same industry that had once framed her as a fantasy had no structure in place to protect her when that fantasy collapsed. On February 15, 2016, in a hospital in Fremont, California, Vanity died from kidney failure, a final result of the damage wrought by years of drug use and the illness that followed. The shock was not only that she was gone, it was the blunt truth her story exposed. A woman who had been elevated as a symbol of desire and glamour ended her life in a broken body, fighting conditions directly linked to the addiction that had once seemed like an invisible secret. Her journey stands as one of the clearest examples of how addiction does not just steal careers. It rewrites the body itself. 11. Queen Latifah, broken after her brother's death. By the late 1980s, Queen Latifah had already carved out a rare position. In a world where female rappers were often sidelined, she stood tall, confident, commanding with a voice that demanded respect. The 1990s opened even more doors. Acting roles, television film offers. She was on the verge of becoming exactly what she later became, a globally recognized multi-hyphenate artist. Then in March 1992, everything snapped. Her brother Lancelot, her closest ally and emotional anchor, died in a motorcycle accident. It was not just a loss. It was a rupture. The blood-stained helmet became an object she could not stop seeing, a symbol of finality that refused to fade. In the aftermath, Latifah reportedly turned inward and downward. Alcohol arrived first, then drugs. Not as recreation but as punishment and escape blended together. Friends would later describe haunting scenes in her New Jersey apartment, Latifah sitting for hours in silence, holding her brother's helmet, an empty bottle nearby, white traces on the table. On at least one occasion they had to break the door open. Inside they found her on the floor, shaken, tears on her face, breathing heavy with liquor and withdrawal. The Queen, who had seemed invincible in videos and on stage, was in that small room, someone else entirely, a grieving sister, trying to outrun pain that refused to move. Throughout the 1990s, several major film opportunities slipped away. She was not in a stable enough place to accept them or to carry them through. Later she would acknowledge that drugs and alcohol delayed her transition from respected rapper to the full-force acting and hosting career she eventually built. In time, Queen Latifah got sober and climbed to the position the world now recognizes, an award-winning actress, host, and producer. But the shadow of 1992 never fully disappeared. It marked her story with a permanent reminder. Addiction did not appear in her life by accident. It arrived through the open wound of grief. 12. Mary J. Blige. Addiction.